The phone rang incessantly on Daniel's desk, echoing in the small apartment he called home. Daniel, 32, was focused on his computer, meticulously reviewing the details of a project. The screen was filled with numbers and graphs, but his mind was absent, lost in a fog of scattered memories he had been trying to avoid for years. The persistent ringing of the phone, however, brought him back to reality, forcing him to look at the display. It was Clara, his older sister. He knew that a call from her in the middle of the week was not a good sign. "Hi, Clara," he answered hesitantly, almost expecting the worst. "Daniel, it's about Dad," Clara began, her voice laden with restrained tension. He died last night?" Time seemed to stop. Daniel didn't respond, letting the silence fill the space between them. Clara waited patiently, giving him the time he needed to process the news. "When is the wake?" Daniel finally asked, his voice sounding almost robotic, as if the information hadn't really registered. "Tonight at 7, Clara replied softly. I know how difficult it's been for you, but it's important that you come." Daniel wasn't sure if he could face what that trip would entail. He had distanced himself from the town where he grew up, building a life far removed from the ghosts of his past. His father, a stern and authoritarian man, always made Daniel feel like a burden, a disappointment. For Clara, things hadn't been much better, but she seemed to have found a way to cope with it. Daniel, on the other hand, preferred to forget. I don't know, Clara. I don't know if I can," he murmured. "I understand," Clara replied. There was a touch of sadness in her voice, but also acceptance. "But please think about it. It's a chance to close this chapter in some way." Daniel hung up the phone without giving a definitive answer. He sat there, staring at the computer screen without really seeing it. Memories began to infiltrate his mind, bringing back scenes from a childhood marked by harsh words and disapproving glances. He closed his eyes, trying to push them away, but it was futile. There were things that could not be forgotten, only buried. In the end, he gave in. He took a bus to his hometown, feeling a mix of nausea and resignation grow with every mile traveled. The journey seemed to lead not just to a physical place but to a series of suffocating memories. He looked out the window, watching familiar landscapes pass by, reminders of a past he would prefer not to relive. His mind kept returning to one particular scene. His father, tall and imposing, speaking with a coldness that always made Daniel feel smaller than he truly was. When he arrived at Clara's house, she welcomed him with a warm hug but also with a worried expression. Clara was only 2 years older, but she had always been like a second mother to him, trying to protect him as best she could from their father's severity. She was the closest thing he had to family, the only one who fully understood what they had both endured. "I know this is hard," Clara began as she guided him inside the house. "But we need to do this together, Daniel. We need to put an end to this." Daniel just nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Clara prepared tea for him, trying to ease the tension that hung in the air. They briefly talked about the past, mentioning childhood moments they both tried to reframe in their minds. The conversation was superficial, an attempt to divert from the deeper issues they both avoided. At the wake, Daniel stood in a corner, watching from a distance. His mother, Helena, was seated, surrounded by distant relatives and acquaintances he hadn't seen in years. She looked aged, almost unrecognizable, her shoulders hunched under the weight of a life marked by difficult choices. He didn't know what to say to her, whether he should say anything at all. "You should go talk to her," Clara suggested gently, coming closer. "She has her own scars too." Daniel took a deep breath but stayed where he was. The thought of approaching Helena made him feel as if he were being pulled into a current of emotions he didn't know how to handle. He blamed her for many things: her passivity in the face of their father, her inability to intervene. But at the same time, there was a small part of him that understood she was also a victim of that man's relentless control. When the wake was over, Clara asked him to accompany her to the old family home, which was now for sale. Daniel hesitated but eventually agreed. The house was a relic of dark times, and he had done everything he could to forget every detail of its interior. But Clara seemed determined to make him face his demons. The house was exactly as he remembered, an old, imposing structure with large windows that never let in enough light. Upon entering, Daniel felt a sense of oppression, as if the walls were closing in around him. Each room brought back a distinct memory, from the muffled screams to the nights he hid in the attic, trying to escape the tension that always filled the air. Clara suggested they go down to the basement, where they used to play as children. Daniel hesitated but followed her. The basement was dark and damp, just as he remembered. The shelves were covered in dust and old boxes were piled in the corners. Clara began rummaging through some of them while Daniel stood still, his eyes fixed on nothing. "I found something," Clara said, holding up a wooden box. Inside the box were letters and a small diary, both belonging to their mother. Clara began flipping through the pages of the diary, and Daniel saw her expression change, a mix of surprise and sadness. She handed him a letter, one that was addressed to him. "It's for you," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel took the letter, feeling its weight in his hands. He knew he should read it, but there was an overwhelming fear inside him, a reluctance to discover what his mother might have written. But something compelled him to open the envelope, and he began to read the words his mother had penned years ago but never had the courage to give him. In the letter, Helena spoke of her regrets, her fears, and her lack of strength to protect her children. She admitted her failures as a mother and asked for forgiveness, explaining that she had been just as lost and terrified as they were. The words were a mix of pain, guilt, and a sincere desire to be forgiven. Daniel felt a knot form in his throat. He didn't know what to think or feel. The letter made it clear that his mother wasn't the cold and distant figure he had always imagined, but a woman broken by circumstances. But that didn't erase the scars, nor did it change the fact that he and Clara had been left to bear the weight of that man alone. When Clara suggested he confront their mother, Daniel felt torn. Part of him wanted to walk away and forget everything, but another part knew Clara was right. He needed answers, he needed closure. Daniel decided to confront his mother, even without knowing if he was prepared for what would come next. The chapter ends with Daniel standing hesitantly outside the room where Helena was. He took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to enter, unsure if the conversation would bring healing or more pain. The door to the room was ajar, letting a beam of light cut through the dimness of the hallway. Daniel stood there, frozen for a moment that felt like an eternity, gazing at the doorway as if it were a barrier separating the present from the past. What he hoped to find inside was as uncertain as his own emotions at that moment. The air felt thick and Daniel's breathing became increasingly labored. It was as if each step he took toward the room was a plunge into unknown waters. When he finally pushed the door open, he saw Helena sitting in an armchair looking out the window. The soft light of the evening outlined her gray hair, cascading over her shoulders like a blanket. She didn't notice him immediately. Her eyes were distant, fixed on some point beyond the trees outside. Daniel couldn't remember the last time he had been so close to her. There was something fragile about her presence, a striking contrast to the image he had kept of her in his memory. "Can I come in?" Daniel asked, his voice weaker than he intended. Helena startled slightly, coming out of her reverie. When she turned to look at him, her face was surprised, but there was a hint of hope in her eyes. Daniel had the impression that she had been waiting for this conversation for years but had never had the courage to initiate it. "Of course, Daniel," she replied, her voice sounding tired, as if the words were weighed down by a lifetime of burdens. "Please come in." Daniel stepped into the room but stopped at a safe distance, uncertain about how to proceed. For years he had cultivated silence around his memories. Now the words he needed to say were stuck in his throat, a mix of anger, pain, and questions that had never received answers. "Clara gave me a letter from you," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. You wrote to me but you never gave it to me." Helena lowered her eyes as if ashamed. She took a deep breath before responding. "I wanted to give it to you but there was always something stopping me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was afraid. Afraid that you would hate me more than you already do." The word hate hung in the air. Daniel didn't know what to say. In his mind he had spent so many years trying to avoid his feelings that now, in front of his mother, he didn't know how to express them. Why was he even there? What did he hope to achieve with this conversation? Answers? Apologies? Or something more? "I never knew what to do," Helena continued, not looking at him. "Your father was a difficult man. I was young and weak. I couldn't protect you as I should have." "He was more than difficult," Daniel interrupted, his voice louder and angrier than he intended. "He treated us like we were less than nothing. And you just stood there watching it all happen." Helena seemed to shrink under the accusation. She closed her eyes as if trying to absorb the pain of hearing those words out loud. Daniel had expected her to deny it, to try to justify herself, but instead she simply nodded as if agreeing. "I know," she whispered. "I failed." There was a long silence between them, filled with unspoken memories. Daniel felt a pang of guilt but also of relief. Part of his anger stemmed from the absence of validation all those years. He needed someone to recognize what he had suffered, to accept that it wasn't his fault. "Why didn't you leave?" Daniel asked, his voice now lower, almost a murmur. Why did you stay with him? Why did you let us go through all of this? Helena took a long time to respond. Daniel could see she was struggling to find words that would make sense, both for him and for herself. I was trapped, she finally said, choosing her words carefully. Trapped by fear, by dependency, by shame. I believed at first that he would change. That if I did everything right, he would change. And when I realized that would never happen, it was too late for me. But I wanted to believe it was still not too late for you. Daniel felt a knot form in his throat. He had spent so long blaming her for her passivity that he never stopped to consider how much she might have suffered too. It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation. I couldn't understand that when I was a child, he said. And I don't know if I can understand it now. I don't expect you to understand or to forgive me, Helena replied, finally raising her eyes to meet his. But I needed you to know. I needed you to know that I wasn't indifferent, that I never wanted you to suffer. Daniel looked at her, trying to see the woman who was now revealing herself before him. There was something profoundly human in her fragility, something he had never recognized before. He had always seen her as someone who didn't act, who didn't intervene. But now he realized that perhaps she was as broken as he was, dealing with invisible scars in a different way. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said, his voice laden with honesty. But I needed to hear that. Helena nodded slowly, accepting Daniel's words as a small step forward. She didn't expect to be forgiven in that moment, but there was relief in knowing he was willing to talk. A silence settled between them, but this time it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence of acceptance, a mutual recognition that they both carried wounds that would take time to heal. Daniel left the room, feeling strangely light yet exhausted at the same time. He found Clara waiting for him in the hallway, her expression heavy with anticipation. So what happened? She asked. It was difficult, Daniel replied. But maybe it was a start. Clara nodded, and a small smile of understanding appeared on her lips. She knew that for Daniel each step in this journey felt like crossing a minefield, but she was proud of him for facing something he had avoided for so long. Let's get out of here, Clara suggested. Let's go to the old house. I think we need to see it together. Daniel hesitated but agreed. Maybe Clara was right. Perhaps revisiting the old house was necessary for him, a way to confront what he had always evaded. As they walked to the car, Daniel felt a mix of anxiety and curiosity. It was as if destiny was pulling him into a new phase of his journey. The old family house was just a few minutes away. When they arrived, Clara parked the car, and they both sat in silence, observing the old structure looming before them. The house seemed smaller than Daniel remembered, as if the weight of memories had compressed it over the years. The windows were dusty and the paint was peeling, but the facade still held traces of the grandeur it once displayed. Ready? Clara asked, breaking the silence. No, Daniel replied honestly. But we're going to do this anyway. They entered the house, and Daniel was immediately hit by a wave of nostalgia and discomfort. The rooms were filled with shadows and echoes of laughter and screams from the past. Every wall, every corner seemed to hold a fragment of a memory he didn't want to relive. Clara walked slowly, guiding him through the house as if it were a tour of a museum of memories. This place has always been scary, she commented, trying to ease the tension. But somehow it was also the only home we ever knew. Daniel didn't respond. His mind was occupied with involuntary memories, like flashes from an old movie. He remembered hiding in the attic during arguments, playing in the basement to escape the tension upstairs, and the quiet nights when he and Clara whispered stories to ward off fear. Let's go down to the basement, Clara suggested, interrupting his thoughts. Daniel hesitated but followed his sister. The basement was darker than he remembered, the smell of mold mixed with dust hung in the air. Clara turned on a small flashlight and began to explore the stacked boxes. That's when she found the wooden box and opened it, revealing the letters and diary of their mother. Daniel felt a chill at the sight of the box's contents. Those old papers held secrets he had never known, secrets that could change the way he saw his mother, his family, and even himself. This is surprising, Clara said as she flipped through the pages of the diary. She never mentioned any of this. Daniel didn't know how to react. It felt as if he were being forced to look into a mirror and see a reflection different from what he had always imagined. Clara handed him a specific letter addressed to him, and Daniel stood there, holding that piece of paper with trembling hands. It was as if the past was reaching out to him, demanding to be confronted once and for all. The envelope was made of aged paper with yellowed and worn edges. Daniel's fingers trembled as he held that small relic, feeling the symbolic weight of decades of accumulated silence. Clara stood by his side, waiting quietly, respecting the moment. She knew that, at that instant, the decision to open the letter or not belonged solely to Daniel. "Do you want to be alone?" she asked, almost in a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile thread of concentration he maintained. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He was lost in a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions. His mind was filled with questions. Why had his mother never given him the letter? What did she want to say? He felt a mix of anger, curiosity, and fear all at once. There was so much he didn't know about his own family history, and that letter seemed to be a key to a locked room within him. "No," he finally responded, his voice low but firm. I need to read this now." Clara nodded and stepped back, keeping close but respecting Daniel's space. He took a deep breath and opened the envelope, feeling the texture of the thin paper as he unfolded the letter. The handwritten words were slightly faded but still legible. Helena's handwriting was careful and a bit shaky, revealing the emotional difficulty she must have faced while writing it. Daniel began to read silently, and the words hit him like a punch in the stomach. My dear son, there are so many things I wish I had said to you, so many conversations we never had. I know you blame me for many things, and perhaps you have every right to do so. I failed to protect you, I failed to be the mother you needed me to be. But I want you to know that every decision I made was out of fear, not indifference. I was young and believed that love could change your father. I thought that if I were obedient, if I didn't cause problems, he would change. When I realized that wouldn't happen, it was too late. And then, I believed that perhaps it was too late for me, but it might still be different for you and Clara. I know this doesn't excuse my mistakes, but you need to know that I never wanted you to feel alone. I never wanted you to believe that I didn't care. I was terrified, lost, and didn't know how to ask for help. If you ever read this letter, I hope you know that my love for you has always been greater than my mistakes. Even though I never had the courage to give you this letter, I needed to write it. Because I needed to believe that one day, somehow, you would find these words and understand that I was human, weak, and full of flaws. I know that you may never forgive me, but I hope that one day you find peace to move on. With all my love. Mom. Helena's words seemed to echo in Daniel's mind, resonating like a sad and sincere lament. He felt a whirlwind of emotions and struggled to organize his thoughts. It was as if a door inside him had been opened, and behind it, there were no definitive answers, but rather a confusion of conflicting feelings: anger, sadness, compassion, and a sense of shared helplessness. Clara watched in silence, respecting Daniel's internal struggle. When he finished reading, he folded the letter carefully, as if he were handling something precious yet painful. He couldn't look at Clara, knowing she was waiting for a reaction, for an outburst, something to show what he was feeling. Did she really believe she was protecting us? Daniel murmured, more to himself than to Clara. I think so, Clara replied gently. She was as lost as we were. Just in a different way. Daniel shook his head, trying to digest those words. In his mind, his mother had always been a silent accomplice, a passive witness to everything their father had done. But for the first time he began to see Helena in a new light, not as an indifferent woman, but as someone who was also trapped in a web of fear and control. I don't know what to do with this, Daniel admitted, his voice trembling slightly. You don't have to do anything right now, Clara said. Just process it in your own time. Daniel nodded, but the weight of the letter still lingered, hanging over him like a persistent shadow. He knew he needed to talk to his mother again, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The conversation they had before was difficult, but it was only a shallow surface of everything that needed to be addressed. Now he had new questions, new revelations, and a growing sense of urgency to get answers. I'm going to need some time, he finally said, looking at Clara, to understand what this means. Clara nodded and smiled, understanding. She knew that forcing Daniel to make quick decisions wouldn't help. He was just beginning to explore layers of his past that he had kept buried for years. It was a slow and painful process, but necessary. If you need me, I'll be here, Clara assured him, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. They decided to leave the basement and return to the surface. The air felt lighter outside of that damp darkness, but Daniel felt as though he were carrying an invisible anchor in his chest. As they walked through the house, memories came and went, like ghosts passing through walls. Daniel wondered if he would ever be able to see that house without feeling that familiar tightness in his chest. Back on the main floor, Clara suggested they go back to her house. Daniel agreed, feeling emotionally drained. During the drive, they talked about trivial matters, trying to relieve the tension that had settled between them. Daniel knew Clara was trying to distract him, to give him a moment to breathe, and he appreciated that. Arriving at Clara's house, Daniel retreated to the guest room. He sat on the bed, still holding his mother's letter, and looked out the window. Outside, the evening light was fading into darkness, and he found himself thinking about how the metaphor was fitting for what he was going through. For so long he had kept the past in the dark, but now, slowly, lights were turning on, revealing shadows he never wanted to confront. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. His mind was racing, replaying the words of his mother's letter, trying to reconcile what he knew about her with what he had read. There was a conflict inside him, a battle between a son's anger and a man beginning to see the human side of his mother. The next day, Daniel woke up early and decided he needed to talk to Dr. Marcos, the therapist. He picked up the phone and scheduled a session for the same day. Clara noticed the determination in his eyes and didn't ask questions. She just gave him an encouraging smile before he left. In the session, Daniel felt tenser than ever. Dr. Marcos welcomed him with a friendly nod and asked him to sit down. "How was your weekend?" Dr. Marcos asked, breaking the ice. Daniel hesitated before responding. He felt that his words would be inadequate to describe the emotional whirlwind he had gone through. "I found a letter from my mother," he began, feeling his voice falter slightly. "She wrote to me years ago but never gave it to me." "That must have been an intense moment," Dr. Marcos commented, without judgment, simply waiting for Daniel to continue. "And it was. The letter, it explained so many things, but at the same time, it left so many questions," Daniel said. "She admitted she was afraid. That she tried to protect us but didn't know how." Dr. Marcos remained silent, giving him space to vent. Daniel knew the therapist wasn't there to provide answers but to help him discover his own conclusions. "I always thought she was just weak," Daniel continued, struggling to find the right words. "But now I realize she was as trapped as Clara and I were." "How does that make you feel?" Dr. Marcos asked. "Confused," Daniel admitted. "And a little guilty. For not having understood before." Dr. Marcos nodded. "It's normal to feel confusion when confronting new information about something we've carried for so long. And it's also natural to feel guilt, but it's important to remember that you were a child back then. You couldn't have the same perceptions you have today." Daniel reflected on those words. He knew he had a long journey ahead to process all these new revelations, but he was starting to realize that maybe he was on the right path. Dr. Marcos suggested a new task, that Daniel write a letter back to his mother, saying everything he had always wanted to say without filters. Daniel left the session with a restless mind, knowing that this task could be the next step in releasing the weight he had carried for so many years. The sheet of paper lay before Daniel, white and empty, reflecting the sense of indecision and fear he felt. The task that Dr. Marcos had given him seemed simple in theory, to write a letter to his mother, expressing everything he had kept bottled up for so long. But whenever Daniel tried to put words on the paper, he felt an overwhelming blockage. It wasn't just about what to say but how to say it. He was used to keeping his feelings locked away, hidden like something that shouldn't be touched. Sitting in his apartment, he looked at the clock. Hours passed and the sheet remained blank. Instead of making progress, he began to lose himself in thoughts, reliving scenes from his childhood like involuntary flashes. His father shouting, his mother cowering in a corner, and Clara always trying to protect him. Anger returned, pulsing like a dull ache in his chest. He wondered how he could start a letter with so much confusion in his mind. After hours of trial and error, Daniel finally wrote the first words. "Mom, I don't know where to start." The words flowed, hesitant at first, but gradually transforming into a stream of thoughts. He wrote about his memories, his hurts, his feelings of abandonment. He wrote about how difficult it had been to cope with the feeling that she had never defended him. He expressed his anger but also his confusion after reading her letter. It was as if, for the first time, he was allowing himself to say everything he had always suppressed. When he finished, he felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. He left the letter on the table and went out for a walk. The apartment felt too small to contain everything he was feeling. Outside, the sky was overcast and a cold wind blew. Daniel wandered aimlessly through the streets, feeling the cold air clear his mind a bit. As he walked, his thoughts returned to Helena. He wondered if she had felt relief when writing her own letter, or if it had been a last desperate effort to reach a son she knew was drifting away. He felt a pang of empathy that hadn't been there before, and it confused him even more. How could he feel compassion for someone he had blamed for so many years? Back in the apartment, Daniel sat down again in front of the letter he had written. He read it, rereading each word and realizing how filled it was with hurt, but also with an unconscious desire for understanding. It was as if he were searching for something deeper, something he couldn't name. Perhaps it was a plea for reconciliation, or maybe just an attempt to close a chapter. The next day he took the letter to his session with Dr. Marcos. He was nervous but knew he needed to share what he had written. Dr. Marcos greeted him with his usual friendly nod but quickly noticed that Daniel was more tense than usual. "Did you bring the letter?" Dr. Marcos asked calmly. Daniel nodded, handing over the paper. He felt his hands tremble slightly, but he wasn't willing to back down. Dr. Marcos took the letter but didn't read it. Instead he handed it back to Daniel. "I'd like you to read it aloud if you feel you can," Dr. Marcos suggested. Daniel hesitated. Reading the letter to himself in silence had already been difficult. Reading it aloud to someone else felt unbearable. But something in the therapist's encouraging expression gave him strength. He took a deep breath and began. His voice trembled at first, but as he progressed, it gained steadiness. Each word felt heavier when spoken aloud. He realized that, by speaking, his emotions became more tangible. It was as if, by uttering each sentence, he was exorcising ghosts that had haunted him for too long. When he finished, there were tears in his eyes, but not of sadness, rather of exhaustion. It felt as though he had run an emotional marathon. Dr. Marcos waited a few moments, allowing Daniel to catch his breath before speaking. "That was a very courageous act on your part, Daniel," he said, his voice full of empathy. "Allowing yourself to express those feelings is an important step." Daniel nodded, but he didn't feel particularly courageous. Instead, he felt vulnerable, exposed, as if he had opened an old wound that had never healed. "How did it feel while you were reading?" Dr. Marcos asked. "I don't know," Daniel replied, trying to organize his thoughts. "It felt surreal. I felt like I was speaking to someone who had never listened to me before." Dr. Marcos remained silent, waiting for Daniel to continue. "I think that, throughout my life I felt like I never had a voice," Daniel said slowly. "I always felt like my emotions didn't matter, like I had to endure everything in silence." "And now?" Dr. Marcos asked. "Now I feel like, maybe, I have the right to be heard," Daniel responded hesitantly as if testing the idea. "You do, Daniel," Dr. Marcos affirmed. "We all have the right to express our feelings, to be heard and validated. And you are beginning to take that step for yourself." Daniel sat in silence, processing those words. It felt strange to think of himself as someone who deserved to be heard. For so long he had internalized the idea that his emotions were irrelevant, and now he was trying to allow himself to believe the opposite. "And what about your mother?" Dr. Marcos asked. "What would you like to do now that you've written this letter?" Daniel didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to keep the letter to himself, never showing it to anyone. But there was another part, deeper, that felt a desire to share it with Helena. He needed to know how she would react. He needed closure. I think I want to show it to her," he said slowly, as if he were still trying to convince himself. "That's an important decision," Dr. Marcos commented. "And only you can decide when the right moment is. But if you choose to show it to her, remember that it's for your own sake, not to get a specific reaction from her." Daniel reflected on those words as he left the office. Dr. Marcos was right. He couldn't control how his mother would react, but he needed to do it for himself, to free himself from a part of the weight he had been carrying. In the following days, Daniel grew increasingly restless. He knew he needed to confront his mother again, but fear still held him back. He felt like someone standing at the edge of an abyss, unsure if he would have the courage to jump. One night, while in his apartment looking at the letter on the table, he realized he was trying to postpone the inevitable. He made a decision. The next day he would take the car and go to Clara's house, where Helena was staying. If he truly wanted to move forward, he needed to take this step. Clara greeted him with surprise, but he reassured her that he needed to speak with Helena privately. Clara, sensing the seriousness of his tone, agreed and stepped outside to give them space. Helena was sitting on the porch, gazing at the horizon. When Daniel approached, she turned, surprised to see him there. He noticed a mix of relief and apprehension in her eyes. "Daniel?" she said, her voice sounding uncertain. "We need to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Helena nodded, indicating for him to sit beside her. Daniel took the letter from his pocket and held it for a moment before handing it to her. "I wrote you a letter," he said, his tone revealing the tension he was trying to hide. Helena looked at the letter, surprised, but took it gently as if it were something precious. She hesitated for a moment before starting to read. Daniel watched as his mother read, seeing emotions pass across her face: surprise, sadness, regret. When she finished, she remained silent for a long time, holding the letter with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say," she finally murmured, her voice breaking with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Daniel replied, feeling a strange calm wash over him. "I just needed you to know how I feel." Helena lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time, Daniel saw genuine tears on her face. She looked smaller, more fragile, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," she said, her voice faltering. "I know I can't change the past, but I wish I could." Daniel didn't know what to respond. There was still so much unresolved, but he also knew that perhaps there would never be a definitive answer to everything. What mattered now was that he had expressed himself, that he had taken a step toward liberation. They sat there in silence, but this time the silence was less oppressive. It was as if they were both finally acknowledging each other's pain, sharing a moment of vulnerability that they had never had before. Daniel knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt a spark of hope. There were still many invisible scars to heal, but now at least he was beginning to see that it was possible to find some peace. The sky was overcast when Daniel left Clara's house. He drove back to his apartment, trying to organize the thoughts swirling in his mind. The meeting with his mother had been emotionally exhausting but also somewhat liberating. It felt as though he had lifted a great weight from his shoulders, even though there were many others still to bear. However, there was a part of the past that he still hadn't confronted: his father. In the following days, Daniel continued his sessions with Dr. Marcos. He knew he had made progress by facing his mother and exposing his emotions, but something still deeply troubled him. The figure of his father loomed in his mind like a constant shadow. It was a presence he had never managed to confront directly while the man was alive, and now, with his death, he felt he had lost the opportunity to resolve that part of his life. In one session he decided to mention this to the therapist. "I feel like I still have a lot unresolved regarding my father," Daniel said, his voice laden with uncertainty. Dr. Marcos nodded, encouraging him to continue. He knew it was a delicate subject and didn't want to interrupt Daniel's flow of thoughts. "I've always been angry at him," Daniel continued, furrowing his brow as if trying to find words to express his confusion. "But now, after talking to my mother, that anger seems more complicated. I feel like I never fully understood why he was that way, why he needed to be so cruel." Dr. Marcos remained silent, waiting for Daniel to come to his own conclusions. "And I think I need to confront him somehow," Daniel said hesitantly. "But he's dead, so how do I do that?" The therapist paused for a moment, pondering. Finally, he suggested something that seemed simple but Daniel knew would be extremely challenging. "Maybe you could write a letter to him," Dr. Marcos proposed. "Just like you did for your mother. This could be a way to express what you never had the chance to say." Daniel considered the idea, feeling a mix of reluctance and curiosity. Writing a letter to his father? To the man who caused so much suffering and left so many invisible scars? The idea terrified him, but he knew it was something he needed to try. The therapist continued. "The letter doesn't have to be just an outpouring of anger," Dr. Marcos explained. "It can be a space for you to express everything you never managed, your questions, your hurts, even the things you wish you could have said but were silenced by fear or pain." Daniel nodded, but his heart raced. He knew this task would be much harder than the letter to his mother. The anger he felt toward his father was like an unrelenting tide, always present but never faced head-on. Now he was about to dive into that tide and discover what lay in its depths. That night he sat down in front of his laptop. The blank page seemed to mock him, as if challenging him to put his thoughts into words. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to concentrate. In his mind he visualized his father, the hardened face, the severe gaze, the cold and cutting voice. He felt the anger bubble up again, but also a pang of sadness. Finally he began to type. "Father," he wrote, hesitating on how to continue. The word sounded strange and uncomfortable, as if it didn't belong there. It was a title his father never seemed to deserve, but there was no other word to describe him. "Father, I don't know where to start. Maybe because we never had a real conversation, one where I could express what I felt. There was always just your commanding tone, your harsh words, and my attempts to please or to hide. I don't know if you saw me as a son or just as a burden, something you had to endure." Daniel paused for a moment, feeling a knot form in his throat. Memories flooded back like knives piercing his mind. He continued, "I never understood why you treated me that way. I never knew what I did to deserve your anger or contempt. Why did you always need to humiliate me, to belittle me? I was just a child. I needed a father, someone to guide me, not someone to destroy me." As he wrote, Daniel began to feel the tension in his chest intensify. But he pressed on, feeling that he needed to get everything out. I know you must have suffered too. I believe your own childhood must have been difficult, that you didn't know how to be different. But that doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change the nights I hid in the attic because I was afraid to breathe near you. It doesn't change the fact that, for years, you made me believe I was worthless, that I was a mistake. Daniel paused typing for a moment. He felt his heart racing and his hands trembling. It was hard, painful, but there was something liberating about finally being able to say what had never been said. He continued, "But what hurts me even more is that, even after all that, I still wanted your approval. Even after all the cruel words and disapproving looks, there was a part of me that still wanted you to see me, to say you were proud of me. And maybe that's what hurts me the most, the fact that I could never stop seeking something I knew I would never have." Daniel realized that silent tears were streaming down his face. He had never been someone who cried easily, but these words were reopening wounds he didn't know he still carried. He took a deep breath and continued, feeling that he needed to finish. "I don't know if you were aware of what you were doing. I don't know if you understood how much it hurt me. Maybe for you, it was just your way of being, the only way you knew how to communicate. But for me it was like living in a prison where every word you spoke was a sentence, every look, a judgment." He struggled to finish the letter, knowing he needed closure. "I don't know if I will ever be able to fully forgive you. There is still so much pain, and forgiveness isn't a simple thing. But by writing this, I realize that it may not just be about forgiving you, but about freeing myself from the weight I've been carrying. I hope that wherever you are, you can find the peace you never had here. And I hope that one day I can too." Daniel finished typing and read the letter one more time. He felt exhausted, but there was a sense of relief. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a step. He no longer needed to carry those words trapped inside him. In the following days, Daniel took the letter to his session with Dr. Marcos. When he arrived, he felt his anxiety was at the surface, but he knew he needed to do this. The therapist welcomed him with his usual calm demeanor and asked him to sit down. "Did you manage to write the letter?" Dr. Marcos asked gently. Daniel nodded and handed over the folded sheet of paper. Dr. Marcos took it but didn't read it right away. He was waiting for Daniel to take the initiative just as he had before. "Do you want to read it to me?" Dr. Marcos asked. Daniel took a deep breath. He knew that reading aloud would make it more real, more significant. After a moment of hesitation, he began to read. As he pronounced each word, he felt the anger, sadness, and hurt resurfacing, but he also felt something different. A recognition that he was beginning to confront the monsters of his past. When he finished, Dr. Marcos remained silent for a few moments, allowing Daniel to calm down. Finally he spoke. "Daniel, it was very courageous of you to express all of this," Dr. Marcos said sincerely. "You weren't just writing a letter to your father, you were writing a letter to that scared child you once were, who needed to be heard." Those words touched something deep inside Daniel. He had never thought of it that way, but now it made sense. He was, in a way, rescuing that frightened child who never had the chance to defend himself or be understood. Dr. Marcos suggested that Daniel keep the letter as a reminder of his courage or burn it as a symbolic act of release. Daniel still didn't know what he would do, but he was beginning to realize that, regardless of his choice, he was slowly learning to free himself from the past and build a new future for himself. The sky was gray and heavy that morning, reflecting Daniel's state of mind. He woke up earlier than usual, unable to find peace in sleep. Throughout the night, thoughts about his letter to his father had tormented him, mixing memories and emotions in an internal storm. There was a growing feeling that something was shifting within him, a transformation he still didn't know if he was ready to accept. The days became long and burdensome after the session with Dr. Marcos. He couldn't stop thinking about how he had confronted the figures of his parents in such a short time. First, his mother, who now seemed like a complex shadow of regret and fragility. And now, his father, someone he never believed he could forgive, but with whom he was slowly learning to make peace within himself. Daniel decided to accept Dr. Marcos's advice and keep the letter as a reminder of his courage, at least for now. He carefully folded it and stored it in a box on the top shelf of his wardrobe. He didn't want to burn it, not yet. The letter was a part of his journey, a symbol of his first attempt to confront his inner demons, and he knew that even if he wanted to, he couldn't dispose of that memory so easily. Over time, Daniel began to reflect on something Dr. Marcos had said. He was writing not only to his father but also to the boy he once was, the lost boy haunted by feelings of inadequacy. Those words reverberated within him, and he started to wonder what it really meant to take care of that boy, what it meant to rescue that part of himself. It was Clara who, unknowingly, gave him a glimpse of an answer. One day she invited him for lunch at her house, something she did whenever she felt Daniel needed company. Clara had become a constant support, someone who understood his internal struggles without needing many words. They didn't need to fill the silence with superficial conversations. Their connection was something deeper, forged by years of mutual understanding. During lunch, Clara began to talk about her children, something she always did with enthusiasm. Daniel didn't mind hearing stories about his nephews because he felt a kind of hope through them, something he had never experienced in his childhood. They were proof that life could be different, that it was possible to create healthy bonds even after a life of pain. Sometimes I think about how I want them to know they are loved, even when I make mistakes, Clara said, her voice soft but determined. I want them to always feel they can come to me, that they can trust me. Daniel watched her as she spoke, admiring her strength. Clara always had a remarkable ability to forgive and move on, something he still struggled to achieve. She was his bridge between the past and the present, a reminder that it was possible to find resilience even after everything they had been through. You've done a great job with them, Daniel said, his voice full of sincerity. Clara smiled, but there was something more in her gaze, a latent concern she finally decided to voice. And what about you, Daniel? Clara asked, her voice hesitant. How are you really doing? Daniel hesitated before answering. Part of him wanted to keep his emotions to himself, but he knew he needed to be honest, especially with Clara. She had been his ally for so long, and he knew he owed her that honesty. I'm confused, he admitted, his voice low. I think I'm starting to see things differently, but it's hard. Everything feels mixed up. Clara nodded, understanding. She placed her hand over his, a simple gesture but filled with meaning. That's part of the process, Clara said in a gentle yet firm tone. I took years to start understanding how to move forward. And to be honest, I'm still learning. Her words made Daniel feel a little less isolated. He wasn't the only one fighting against the ghosts of the past. Clara also carried scars but had found a way to turn them into something stronger. You've always been the strong one, Daniel commented with a hint of admiration. No, I just learned to rebuild myself, Clara replied, her voice full of hard-won wisdom. And you can too. But you need to start by forgiving yourself. Daniel reflected on those words. Forgive himself? He had never thought of it that way before. He had been so focused on forgiving his parents, or learning to cope with the past, that he hadn't considered the possibility that he needed to be kind to himself. He had always seen himself as weak for not being able to handle things differently, for not being more courageous or resilient. But what if he wasn't weak but simply human? The next day, Daniel went to his session with Dr. Marcos. He felt he needed to explore this new concept of self-forgiveness, something that was so outside his emotional comfort zone. Clara said something yesterday that's been resonating in my head, Daniel began as he settled into his usual chair in the office. She said I need to forgive myself. Dr. Marcos nodded, encouraging him to continue. But I don't know what that means, Daniel admitted. I feel like I've always been guilty for everything that happened. As if I've somehow failed. Why do you feel that way? Dr. Marcos asked, his voice calm and neutral. Daniel reflected before answering. He had always felt inadequate, as if he were the cause of his own pain in some way. I feel that way because I never managed to be the son my father wanted, Daniel finally said, his voice heavy with years of self-criticism. And I feel like maybe I never tried hard enough to change things. Daniel, you were a child, Dr. Marcos affirmed gently but firmly. The weight of trying to change a dysfunctional family dynamic should never have been placed on your shoulders. Those words resonated in Daniel in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent so many years believing that, in some way, it was all his fault. Even when he confronted his parents, there was a part of him that always carried that silent guilt. I never thought of it that way, Daniel admitted, almost in a whisper. That's common in children who grow up in abusive homes, Dr. Marcos explained. They internalize guilt because it's easier to believe that, somehow, they have control over the situation. Facing the fact that parents, the figures who should be protective, failed is extremely painful. So many children prefer to blame themselves rather than accept that reality. Daniel remained silent, absorbing those words. They brought a new perspective on his own behavior, his own emotions. He had never realized that his harsh self-criticism was, in fact, a survival mechanism, a way to try to maintain some illusion of control. In the days that followed, Daniel began to reflect more deeply on the idea of forgiving himself. He started to realize that, to move forward, he needed to stop blaming himself for things that were beyond his control, for circumstances he didn't choose but had to endure. One rainy afternoon while he was in his apartment, Daniel did something he had never done before. He took out a picture of himself as a child. The photo was stored in an old box and he found it by chance while looking for other things. It was a faded photo taken at a beach with him and Clara running on the sand. He vaguely remembered that day, a rare occasion when his family seemed happy. He looked at the boy in the photo, trying to see him as a person separate from himself. He tried to view that boy as he would see another child, someone vulnerable with hopes, fears, and a desperate need for love and validation. For the first time he felt compassion for himself. He felt sadness for the boy he had been, who went through so much and was never truly heard or understood. "I'm sorry," Daniel murmured to the photo, feeling tears roll down his face. "I'm sorry I didn't take better care of you." It was a simple yet transformative moment. Daniel knew he wasn't completely healed, that there was still a long road ahead, but this was an important step. He was beginning to see himself not as someone broken or flawed, but as someone who had survived, someone who was learning to rebuild himself. Dr. Marcos challenged him to take a new step, to try to envision his future without the shackles of the past. Daniel didn't know how to do this, but he was willing to try. For the first time he felt a small spark of hope indicating the right direction. It was a sunny day when Daniel woke up with a different feeling in his chest. For weeks he had been exploring his memories and emotions, trying to understand how his past traumas had shaped him, but also how they didn't have to define him forever. It had been a painful and revealing process, and he knew the road to healing was still in its early stages. However, for the first time in a long time, he felt a small flame of hope pointing him in the right direction. After the last session with Dr. Marcos, Daniel received a new challenge: to imagine his future without the chains of the past. At first, this idea seemed almost impossible. For so long, he had lived under the weight of his memories, letting them dictate each of his actions and fears. But now, he was beginning to understand that the key to his freedom wasn't in forgetting the past but in learning not to be its prisoner. He decided then to do something he had been avoiding for years: visit his father's grave. For many, this might seem like a simple act of farewell or a gesture of respect, but for Daniel, it symbolized a final confrontation with a figure who had dominated his life and emotions. He knew he wouldn't find all the answers in that place, but perhaps it was the closure he needed to take the next step. Upon arriving at the cemetery, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He walked among the rows of graves, looking for his father's name engraved on one of the headstones. When he finally found it, he felt his body tense and his hands sweaty. There was the name that had haunted him for so many years, carved into the cold marble. It was a simple name, without any epitaph or message suggesting redemption or greatness. He stood in silence for a few minutes, trying to process the idea of standing before that man, even if only symbolically. There was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions swirling inside him: anger, sadness, longing for a relationship that never existed, and a sense of emptiness that had accompanied him throughout his adult life. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his words dissipating in the wind. Daniel hadn't brought flowers. He didn't know if he wanted to honor that man, but he knew he needed closure. So he decided to just speak, even if his words would never be heard. "I wrote a letter to you," Daniel began, his voice trembling. "But I don't think it's enough. There are so many things left unsaid between us, and maybe there was never room for that. But now I need to say them." He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. He was there, standing at his father's grave, but it wasn't just about his father. It was about himself, about finding the peace that had always eluded him. "I hated you for a long time," he admitted, almost in a whisper. "I hated the way you made me feel, the way you belittled me, made me believe I wasn't enough. And that anger consumed me. It stopped me from trusting other people, from believing in myself, from living a life without fear." As he spoke, tears began to silently fall down his face. Daniel no longer tried to hide his emotions. He had learned that they were part of the healing process. "But now, I think I understand a little more about you," he continued, his voice becoming steadier. "I understand that you were also a victim of your own demons, your own traumas. That doesn't excuse what you did, but I need to believe you didn't know how to be different." Daniel paused for a moment, feeling a weight slowly lifting from his chest. It was as if, by verbalizing these words, he was giving himself permission to let go of part of the anger that had held him captive for so long. "I don't know if I can fully forgive you," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "But I'm trying. And I think at this moment, that's the most I can do." He stayed there for a few more minutes, just feeling the wind caress his face. He didn't expect an epiphany or a sudden sense of relief. He knew those things took time. But there was a small comfort in having faced that moment, in having said what needed to be said, even if the headstone remained silent. As he left the cemetery, Daniel felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He knew there was still much work to be done, many conversations with Dr. Marcos, many days of ups and downs. But now he was ready to try something new, something that might bring a little light into his life. And it was Clara who suggested the next step. "I've been thinking," Clara said as they had coffee at a cafe the following week. "What if you did something meaningful with the old house? I know we've talked about selling it, but what if you could turn it into something positive?" Daniel hesitated. He had always wanted to get rid of that house, that relic of dark times. But Clara seemed to have an idea, something he hadn't considered. "Like what?" he asked, curious. "I've been thinking about how we could use the house to help other people," Clara explained, her voice filled with excitement. "We could turn it into a support center for people who have gone through similar traumas, a place where they could find help, understanding, and perhaps healing." Daniel remained silent, reflecting on Clara's suggestion. It was an idea he had never considered. To him, that house had always represented pain and suffering, but the idea of transforming it into a space of comfort and support was something that brought an unexpected sense of purpose. "I don't know, Clara," he said, hesitant. "It seems so big." "It is," Clara replied, smiling. "But I think we could do something truly meaningful with it. Transform what was once a place of pain into a place of healing. And I think you could be a part of that." The idea of helping other people who had gone through similar traumas began to resonate within Daniel. It was a way not only to face his own past but also to offer something positive to others. He knew what it felt like to be alone and misunderstood, and the idea of creating a space where others could find support was a way to give back while continuing his own journey of healing. After reflecting for a few days, Daniel decided to give Clara's plan a chance. They began working on the idea, making plans and reaching out to organizations that could help them transform the house into a support center. Clara was tireless in her dedication, and Daniel found in her a constant source of inspiration and strength. As the months passed, the house began to transform. They renovated the rooms, brought in volunteer psychologists and therapists, and started creating a space where people from different backgrounds could share their experiences and find support. Daniel felt that as he transformed that house, he was also rebuilding himself from within. The transformation of the house became a symbol of his own journey. It wasn't a quick or easy process. There were days when Daniel felt overwhelmed by his own memories, but the idea of helping others pushed him to keep going. He began to realize that by helping others, he was also helping himself. One evening, after a long day of work at the house, Clara and Daniel were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, and there was a gentle breeze that made the leaves on the trees sway softly. "We did it," Clara said, smiling at him. "We turned a place of pain into a place of hope." Daniel looked at his sister and felt a deep gratitude for everything she had done for him. Without Clara, he knew he would never have come this far. She was the anchor that kept him steady amidst his internal storms. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said, his voice full of sincerity. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, I just got lucky to have a brother like you who didn't give up on himself." Daniel stayed silent for a moment, absorbing those words. He had spent so long seeing himself as weak, flawed, but now he was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, he was stronger than he thought. Daniel knew his journey wasn't over yet. He knew the path to healing was long and full of obstacles. But for the first time he felt he was on the right track, that he was learning to break the cycle of pain that had held him captive for so long. And as he watched the sunset beside Clara, he realized there was hope for the future, not just for him but for all those who, like him, carried invisible scars. The support center at the old house was finally open. Clara and Daniel organized a simple yet meaningful opening event. They invited a few close friends, volunteers, therapists, and members of the community who had supported the initiative from the beginning. The house, once silent and heavy, was now full of life. Children ran around the garden, laughing and playing, while the adults chatted and explored the renovated rooms. There was a small garden with newly planted flowers and an open area for meetings and group sessions. For Daniel, seeing the house transformed was a moment of deep satisfaction. It was as if he was witnessing the rebirth of something that had once been a symbol of pain in his life. He knew the project was bigger than him and Clara. It was an opportunity to bring some light to people who were going through their own difficult journeys. However, as he watched the guests interacting and enjoying the space, Daniel also felt a pang of anxiety. Despite the progress he had made, he still carried the fear of failure, of his scars preventing him from being the support that others needed. Dr. Marcos always told him that healing wasn't a state of perfection but a continuous process of acceptance and growth. Daniel was beginning to understand what that meant, but he still struggled to accept that he could be a positive force even without being completely healed. Clara noticed her brother's thoughtful look and approached him, giving him a reassuring smile. "Are you okay?" she asked, her soft voice cutting through his thoughts. Daniel looked at her, hesitating before responding. "I think so," he said slowly. "I'm just trying to take it all in." Clara nodded, understanding. "You've done something amazing, Daniel," she said firmly. "You took something that hurt you deeply and turned it into something that can help so many others. That's more than most people can do." Her words were encouraging, but Daniel still felt the weight of expectations, not those of others but his own. He had spent so long feeling inadequate that now, standing before something that really seemed like a success, he struggled to believe he deserved it. "And what if I can't help people the way I hope to?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Clara smiled gently. "You don't need to have all the answers, Daniel," she said. "Believe me, no one expects you to. The simple fact that you're here, willing to listen and be present, is already a huge help to those who feel alone. You're giving people something you never had, a safe place where they can feel seen and heard." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, but this time, it wasn't a knot of anguish but of emotion. He realized that even while still working on himself, he had already achieved something important. He was creating the kind of environment he had always wished he had when he was younger, a place where silence and pain didn't have to be faced alone. The opening event was a success. Volunteers and therapists expressed their gratitude for the space, and several members of the community showed interest in participating in the support groups that would be organized. As the guests left, Clara and Daniel stayed on the porch, watching the sun set on the horizon. It was a serene evening with a gentle breeze swaying the leaves of the trees. Daniel felt at peace, but there was also a feeling of closure in his heart. He knew he was nearing the end of an important chapter in his journey, but that didn't mean the story was over. "Clara," he said, looking at his sister. "I think I'm starting to find my place." Clara smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and affection. "I always knew you would," she replied. "You just needed to believe in yourself." Daniel reflected on her words. It was true, for so long he had doubted his ability to overcome the past. But now he was beginning to see that healing didn't mean erasing scars but learning to live with them, accepting them as part of who he was. The following week, Daniel decided to do something he had been putting off for years: visit his mother, Helena, at her house. They had had difficult conversations in recent months, but a part of him felt that forgiveness needed to be an active process, a continuous decision to choose understanding over anger. When he arrived at his mother's house, Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The front door was slightly ajar, and he knocked gently before entering. Helena greeted him with a timid smile, as if still getting used to the idea of having him around. She had changed in the past months, becoming more open and more willing to share her own emotions. "Hello, son," she said, her voice filled with affection and a hint of nervousness. "I'm glad you came." "Hi, Mom," Daniel replied, trying to smile but feeling a little anxious. "Me too." They sat in the living room, a simple and cozy space that, in some way, seemed much more welcoming than the memories Daniel had of his childhood. There were photos of Clara and her children scattered on the shelves and small pots of plants that Helena had started to grow. "I wanted to talk," Daniel said, feeling the tension in his voice. "About some things?" Helena nodded, waiting patiently. Daniel took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts before continuing. "I know our conversations before were difficult," he began. "And I am still dealing with a lot of things. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to understand you. And as painful as it has been, I'm starting to accept that we all made mistakes. And that includes myself." Helena listened in silence, and Daniel noticed there were tears in her eyes. She nodded as if receiving each word as a precious gift. "I never expected your forgiveness, Daniel," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But hearing this from you means more than I can express." Daniel smiled, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he wasn't trying to force forgiveness but was simply letting it flow naturally. He knew there were still unresolved issues, wounds that needed time to heal, but he also knew that forgiveness was a continuous process, an act of compassion for both himself and the other. As they talked, Daniel realized that something had changed between them. There was a new connection, a bond of shared vulnerability that hadn't existed before. They were no longer just mother and son trapped in a cycle of pain. Now they were two people trying to reconnect despite all the challenges. When night fell, Daniel said goodbye to his mother and left the house, feeling lighter than ever. He knew his journey wasn't complete, but he was finally learning to live with his scars, to accept them as part of his story but not as his definition. In the following months, the support center continued to grow. Daniel and Clara dedicated themselves to expanding activities, bringing in more volunteers and offering new support groups. The space, which had once been a symbol of pain, was now a place where people shared their stories, found support, and began their own healing journeys. Daniel also continued his sessions with Dr. Marcos, but now the conversations were less about the ghosts of the past and more about hopes for the future. He was beginning to envision a new path, one where he was no longer defined solely by his scars but by his ability to reinvent himself. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch of the support center watching the garden bloom, Daniel realized something important. He had spent so much time trying to find meaning in his pain, an explanation for everything that had happened, that he hadn't noticed that the true meaning lay in the transformation. He no longer needed to be a prisoner of his past. He could use it as fuel to build a better future, both for himself and for others. Clara joined him on the porch, bringing 2 cups of tea. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the leaves move in the wind. There was no longer the weight of the past between them, just the feeling that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. "You did it, Daniel," Clara said softly, smiling. "You found your wings." Daniel looked at his sister, feeling a deep gratitude for everything she had done for him. He knew that without Clara, his journey would have been much harder, perhaps even impossible. But now, looking to the future, he finally felt he could fly. Daniel realized that healing wasn't a destination but a continuous process of choices, of learning to live with his scars and, at the same time, not allowing them to define him. And for the first time, he was ready to face the world with the confidence of someone who had found his strength amid the darkness.